Welcome to another episode of Steele Creek Explorer. I'm your host, Jeremy Stout, and this time we want to introduce you to the exciting and fun hobby of winter bird feeding. There's all sorts of advantages to gain from feeding birds at your own home or coming to the nature center to see our bird feeding. And it's not just good for the birds, it's good for us. It offers us an educational opportunity, helps us to commune with nature and do something nice for critters, especially in a time of year where they might need a little extra help from us. So we'll introduce you to techniques and different feeder types, things to be aware of, keeping your birds safe. But first, let's look at the most basic aspect of feeding birds: what kind of food to use. Welcome back. We're talking about winter bird feeding today. And the first question that you might have with winter bird feeding is, what kind of winter bird food? When you go to your local farm or garden supply store, you'll find that there are all sorts of different food and feeder types. And it can actually be really daunting when you first get started. But it's really not that hard. There are some things to keep in mind. Different species of birds like to eat different kinds of foods. And what you offer will very much affect what birds are coming to your home feeder operations. So as you can imagine, here at the Steele Creek Nature Center, we have a pretty big winter feeding operation. And so I'll show you some of the types we use and talk about some of the different birds that will come to these types. And then in a few minutes, we'll show you the different feeder types and what kinds of foods to put in each one. As I mentioned, there are all sorts of different food types. One thing that nearly everyone will agree is the staple. If you only feed one food item to your birds in the wintertime, this is the one to feed them. There are a number of different sunflower seed types available as bird food, but ornithologists and professional bird feeders agree that black oil sunflower seed is without a doubt the best to feed them. It can be a little more expensive than the striped sunflower seed, but this is a wonderful seed that is very calorie dense, which is very much something the birds are looking for this time of year. And this will attract a great diversity of birds. Not just your traditional seed eaters, but a lot of birds will come to this, especially chickadees, titmice, goldfinches, purple finches, house finches. A whole host of birds will come for the black oil sunflower. If I were only going to feed two items to birds, of course the first would be black oil sunflower. The second would be some kind of a mixed seed that's got a millet base. That's typically, when people think of bird seed, oftentimes what they're thinking of are the millet-based seeds. These are the little yellowish, light-colored pellets you see here. Most bird food that you'd find, say, in a grocery store will be millet-based. This is not nearly as calorie-dense as a food, and it's not the most desirable by birds, but this works especially well in a certain kind of feeder we'll talk about later. And this, especially the mixes that have different kinds of seed items, these can be very, very effective at bringing in some other bird types that maybe won't go to a hanging style feeder, but especially like to land and perch on things and eat out of something like a hopper feeder. This can be a very good food item to offer as well. Another food that you might want to consider, especially in the wintertime, looks like a miniature version of the black oil sunflower seed. This is called thistle seed, or sometimes it goes under the proprietary name Niger, N-Y-J-E-R. This is a seed that is very, very small. It can be for some pretty specialized finches, especially goldfinches and the winters that we get pine siskins here. That's a beautiful little relative of the American goldfinch, pretty little bird. Some years we have them by the thousands in the area, and then some years we see hardly any at all. But this seed is a wonderful food source for them. It can get a little bit expensive, but if you don't have 200 pine siskins wearing it out every single day, a small bag will usually do you for a whole winter long. Also, some of the seed mixes can get pretty specialized. When we look at this one, this seed mix looks almost like a trail mix that us human beings might want to eat. This is a specialized mix. It's a woodpecker mix. Now, woodpeckers will come to almost any of the seed varieties I've already shown you. But this mix is especially designed with woodpeckers in mind. It has a lot of high-fat items that the woodpeckers just love. Nut pieces like walnut and pecan pieces. It's also got some dried-up fruit pieces. Of course, a number of birds would come to this in addition to woodpeckers. And it would also be a pretty big attractant for squirrels and raccoons, I would think, as well. We'll talk more about that later as well. But then, of course, these are all loose feed types. There are other food types you can offer as well. This millet that I mentioned earlier can come on the stalk. You can actually buy that in bulk sometimes. We'll talk about feeding non-bird wildlife here in a moment. But another important food type that goes in a specialized feeder is this stuff called suet. Suet is not a food you would readily think of as a bird food. You can see the bird seed that's in here, but the base of all suet is typically a rendered beef fat. Now, you don't really think of birds as going after beef fat, and of course in the wild they don't. But this can be a really nice high-octane fuel for a lot of winter birds, and this is the time of year that they need it most. This will attract a number of things. You know, a lot of seed eaters will come in for the seeds. We'll bring in woodpeckers for the beef fat and other birds as well. Lots of birds that eat nice, fatty, fleshy grubs and bugs would love this food in the wintertime. But this is also one of the food sources that you're especially going to have to keep safe from raccoons and sometimes squirrels. So let's go take a look at the feeders we have here at the Nature Center and learn a little bit about what they do and what they hold. But here's a couple of standard types of feeders. This is, if you only had one feeder in your yard, this is likely going to be what they might look like. These are two different kinds of hanging feeders. This one right here is a hanging basket feeder that's designed for black oil sunflower seed. You always need to make sure that your feeder type matches the feed that you're going to put in it. Oftentimes the black oil sunflower feeders and the thistle feeders will look almost identical to one another, but the size of the gauge wire will dictate what kind of food you can put in it. The larger openings in the wire is for black oil, of course, and then the smaller openings will be for thistle. Here at the Nature Center, instead of having a basket style for the thistle seed, we actually have a tube style. You'll notice most of our feeders don't actually have perches on them, but our tube feeder does. Most of the time with most feeders, perches are not only unnecessary, but they actually are not desirable. But in the case of these slick tube feeders, it's smooth plastic. It would be totally impossible for the birds to land on it without these. And then there are these very small openings that they can get their little beaks in to take some of the thistle out. These are some excellent hanging style feeder options that you may want to consider for your home feeding operation. Well, here we have a multi, all-inclusive feeding station here. Several different feeders, lots of stuff going on. We have another hanging basket for the black oil sunflower seed. It's a different style, but the same idea is what we had going on over there. We've also got a cage for suet. We showed you suet cakes earlier. You do have to have a cage to put these in to keep some of your non-desirable species from just taking the suet cake and running off with it. And then this right here is one that you don't see very often. This is called a platform feeder, adequately named, and a lot of the woodpeckers especially love to come stand on level ground to feed. So we have our woodpecker food in this platform feeder. This kind of feeder also works really well for those millet mixes, those mixed seed mixes that I showed you earlier. And you'll notice the design here is pretty minimalistic. This is called a shepherd's hook. You can get these normally with the feeders and the feed itself. And you'll also notice something else going on with some of our feeders. whatever you do, you're probably going to have conflicts with, shall we say, non-bird animals that maybe you're not trying to feed. And we'll give you some tips for dealing with those as well. Well, for most home feeding operations, this is as much non-desirable animal protection as you would need. This is a standard hopper style feeder with some mixed bird feed in it, but you'll notice the bell-shaped thing sitting on top. Looks sort of like a metallic umbrella. That is a squirrel guard that can go either under your feeder if it's on something like a shepherd's hook, and it keeps the squirrels from scaling the shepherd's hook to get to the feeders. Or in this case, it keeps the squirrels from coming off the side of our building and accessing the feeder. Oftentimes, that's as much protection as you'll need from squirrels, which are the most common non-bird raiders of bird feeders. Now, this is something you don't often find in the bird food section. This is something we've had to improvise at the Nature Center, and this is probably more than you would ever need at your home feeding stations. This is actually a piece of stovepipe because we just use the traditional bell-shaped deterrents for the squirrels, but here at the Nature Center we had a major problem with raccoons getting into our bird feeders, and boy, they can do some serious damage when they climb up the pole and take your feeders down and tear it into pieces. So we improvised this way to just put some stovepipe around our feeders, and that it wobbles a little bit, and it's meant to do that. It's meant to be too wide and too slippery and too unstable. The raccoons can't shimmy around it to get up to the feeders. You'll find that some of your non-desirable species can get pretty crafty at getting your bird food. One thing you're likely to find when you're talking about keeping squirrels away from your bird feeders is that sometimes the best deterrent from your feeders is the old philosophy that if you can't beat them, join them, or at least provide something for them. Oftentimes squirrel feeders make a nice addition to a bird feeding operation because it offers the squirrels something. I mean, hey, just because they're not birds doesn't mean you don't want to offer them a wintertime food source as well. But oftentimes keeping an ear of crack corn or feed corn near but away from your feeders is a great way to keep the squirrels off your feeders. But here's the great secret, is that these aren't just for squirrels either. Birds will come to these as well, so this works for both. I highly recommend keeping a squirrel feeder near but away from your bird feeders if you're going to have a bird feeding station at your home. Well, just this one morning here at the Nature Center, there are several species of birds that we can see coming and going from the feeders. We've got several regular Carolina chickadees that have the black caps on their heads, and often seen with those are the tufted titmice that are a little more skittish than the chickadees, but oftentimes you can find them coming and going from the sunflower together. Now, we've also seen a mockingbird coming and going, and there's also been a red-bellied woodpecker who's been really interested in our squirrel feeder. We've also seen a number of sparrows flitting around along the ground. And there are many more birds that we can see. In fact, on a good morning, a successful feeder operation, you can see 20 or more species of bird on, in, and around the feeders at any given time. There are a number of species that you can only find during the winter. Feeders will attract winter visitors like dark-eyed juncos. As we mentioned before, some years we have large numbers of pine siskins. One of the only warblers that can be found in the wintertime here is the yellow-rumped warbler. And also the purple finch will come to feeders when they're in the area. Of course, other birds will offer a splash of color at the feeders year-round. Northern cardinals will frequent black oil sunflower feeders, and they offer a beautiful splash of red in the wintertime. Well, just some closing remarks on getting your feeders started at home. First and foremost, make sure you're patient. Starting a successful feeder operation, birds are very wary by nature. They're not just going to come into something brand new to them without studying it and watching it for a long time from a distance beforehand. There are some things you can do to make your birds feel safer at home. One thing that we offer at the Nature Center, and I recommend you do it as well, is have what are called staging areas. Birds don't like to come directly to a feeder from far away. they like to come to a shrub or small tree near the feeder where they can watch the feeder for danger. And then they can retreat back to this staging area from the feeder if they feel threatened. This is a very important addition to a successful feeder operation, but you have to be careful by having too much brushy stuff around your feeder. You don't want that because if you offer too much brushy stuff around the feeder, you might be inviting unwanted guests that may be there to eat your birds, like stray house cats. Will use cover to get close to bird feeders. And you definitely want to keep your birds safe if you're feeding them. Remember that when we feed birds, we undergo a responsibility to feed them responsibly. So not offering places to hide for cats and other predators that may want to eat them, unless they're the native hawks that may be there to eat them. Lots of folks don't want to see that at their home feeder operation, but that's nature, and sometimes you end up feeding birds that you're not planning on. But also things to keep in mind are cleanliness. Some folks, some authorities don't even think that we should be feeding birds at all. Because bird feeders can introduce illness to the population. One of the most deadly to birds is conjunctivitis, the eye disease that prevents them from seeing where they're going. So if you're going to feed, and I recommend you do, please keep your feeders clean. A very simple dilution of 1 part bleach to 10 parts water. Soak your feeders every month or so. Just allow them to air dry, and you'll keep those clean and keep your birds from getting sick and transmitting the sickness to others. But before you do that, feel free to come down to the Nature Center. We've got a winter feeding operation that's hopping all year round, but especially we ramp it up in the winter time. So be sure to come to the park because that's where you can be the explorer.